message it sends. The message is that you can be a law-abiding legal resident in the United States and do everything right. And still, if they want to, they can black bag and without any due process, without any chance of appeal, without you ever seeing your family again, send you to Central America and make you spend the rest of your days in a torture dungeon. And they will chuckle about it. This is nothing to them. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is no goal for this project. And for this, I won't ask you to take my word for it. Here is Chief of Staff Stephen Miller laying it out for us. The fundamental error in how immigration is being discussed in the courts and media is pretending that what happened to us over the last 4 years is a routine civil enforcement matter. No, we were invaded and occupied. Entire neighborhoods were conquered. Entire towns were subjugated. Our treasury was plundered. Our democracy was torn apart piece by piece. A national referendum was held on whether to surrender to the invasion or repel it. America voted for liberation. If every foreign trespasser gets to have their own federal trial prior to removal, then there is no liberation. There is no restoration. The invasion will be made complete. Article 4, Section 4 requires the president to hold any invasion, and no district court can override that mandate. For the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The invading armies and foreign trespassers will be expelled. The cartels will be smashed. Liberation will be achieved. The rhetoric you would hear from what used to be called alt-right YouTubers 10 years ago is now the official position of the US government. It's an ethno-nationalist project in which the only requirement for deporting a US resident and eventually citizen is that they are not white. The other side to this deportation project very specifically targets pro-Palestinian activists. And again, this happens nearly every other day now, but the most known names currently are Mahmoud Khalil and Rumeisa Öztürk, both legal residents, both completely innocent of any crime. Both disappeared off the street by plain-clothed ICE officers and now awaiting deportation. And this is just a hunch I have, but I have a hard time believing it is a coincidence that the Trump administration picked pro-Palestinian activists who, again, haven't even been accused of a crime. This is an attempt to push the boundaries, push the Overton window as far as possible on an issue that Democrats, mainstream media, and pressure groups are weak on. The crackdown on pro-Palestinian activists is merely a tool to soften the blow of what comes next. The same way that the persecution of trans people is a tool to pave the way for broader discrimination against LGBT Americans. The issue of pro-Palestinian activism is one over which they can expect the least amount of resistance from liberals. And even for those deported to El Salvador, reading about the democratic response to these deportations, it becomes crystal clear that a number of them haven't understood the gravity of the situation. In mid-April, numerous Democratic lawmakers spoke to Axios about this on the condition of anonymity. And let me just quote a specific section here. The second House Democrat who spoke anonymously, a centrist, called the deportation issue soup du jour, arguing Trump is setting a trap for the Democrats and, like usual, we're falling for it. Rather than talking about the tariff policy and the economy, the thing where his numbers are tanking, we're going to take the bait for one hairdresser. Hairdresser most likely referring to Andre Jose Hernandez, the makeup artist with no criminal record and no record of ever having been a gang member who was deported to El Salvador. Recently, a Time magazine photographer visited the maximum security prison and happened to take a picture of Hernandez. According to the photographer, while this picture was taken, Hernandez said, "I'm not a gang member, I'm gay, I'm a stylist," crying for his mother as he was slapped and had his head shaved. Now, I don't want to give you the perception that the attitude by the anonymous Democratic lawmaker reflects the entire party, because it doesn't, but the rift on this issue again shows the paralysis of the opposition. What if the Trump administration were to deport an American citizen for shouting "from the river to the sea" and accuse him or her of being a Hamas terrorist? Would you trust the Democratic Party to go to bat for someone like that? I personally have my doubts. Further down in the piece, the article states that Democrats would only draw a line in the sand and shut down the House of Representatives if the Trump administration were to deport a US citizen. Now, to draw that line on who seemingly deserves due process and who does not is not only gross, but again displays a fundamental misread of the moment and how to actually fight back against the Trump administration. The reason why the Trump administration is not backing down over people obviously wrongfully deported, why they ignore court orders and double down every chance they get, is because Republicans understand something a number of Democrats seemingly don't. There is something called the political initiative. It's also the point of Steve Bannon's flood the zone approach I read to you earlier. If the Trump administration were to give in on anyone being wrongfully deported, it would put them on the back foot while they desperately want to remain on the offensive. That is the Republican strategy, while the Democrats seemingly don't have one at all right now. Another reason why this distinction is so misguided is that the federal government doesn't even release data on how many citizens are wrongfully detained and removed from the country. An investigation by the Washington Post has determined that right now, as far as we know, over a dozen US citizens have already been deported. This article is from May 3rd, and let me just read to you a short section from it. Last week, 3 children who are US citizens, aged 2, 4, and 7, were removed to Honduras along with their undocumented mothers, according to attorneys and court records. One child, a 4-year-old boy with stage 4 cancer, was sent without medication or access to his doctors. Both families were detained at routine immigration check-ins in New Orleans, denied communication with attorneys or family members, and placed on a flight to Honduras the following morning, the Post reported. Now, this might change, but during the time of researching this video, writing the script, recording the audio, and putting everything together, I haven't seen much talk about the Democrats shutting down the House of Representatives over the deportations. I'll come around to why this is so frustrating to me later, but what I am hearing, or reading, is talk about Democrats shutting down the House over Doge. And we'll see if that turns into anything, but it also brings me to the second front that the Republicans have opened in their attack on American democracy, and that is the literal destruction of the American government. Because it's not just the executive that is moving at a rapid pace. Elon Musk's Doge is moving at a similar speed, dismantling everything they can on the way. I don't want to get too deep into the history of this department named after a 12-year-old meme, but even before Trump took office, it was clear that Elon Musk's plan to reduce supposed government waste either wasn't the actual goal, or that he and his cohorts lacked even the most basic understanding of government spending. As early as October 2024, Musk publicly declared that it should be possible for him to cut, quote, at least $2 trillion, later reducing that estimate to $1 trillion of the US federal budget, and then again to $150 billion. Merely looking at the numbers without giving it a 5-second pause to think, it seems like something that should be doable. US federal budget in 2023 was $6.4 trillion. Surely reducing that by 1 can't be that hard if you're committed to ruthless cuts. Here is where the reality check comes in though. Those $6.4 trillion are basically split up into 3 categories. Mandatory spending, which you cannot cut because this part of the budget has been allocated by Congress for things like social programs, and to make any changes to this part of the budget requires a majority in Congress to change the laws that this money is allocated for in the future. So there's no real room for cuts here. The second category of the US federal budget is interest payments, which you also cannot cut. Which leaves us with the third category of optional spending. Here you have defense, administrative costs, transportation, etc. Now, if you were to cut this entirely overnight, meaning $0 for defense and anything non-defense, you would still be 300k short of Musk's initial goal of $2 trillion. Looking at what makes up the US discretionary budget, it's clear to anyone with the most basic understanding of government spending that cutting $1 trillion is a pipe dream, especially if you don't want to touch defense. Not to mention that the stated aim was to cut waste and fraud, not just cut funds. But that opens up the question of what the actual goal of Doge is, given that the official one is on its face fantastical. The goal of Doge is the demoralization of the federal workforce, dismantling the administrative state, and ultimately the destruction of government. There is a great piece on this in Wired magazine that makes the apt comparison that trying to imagine the long-term effects of what Doge and the Trump administration have even done thus far makes your brain feel like you are trying to imagine how deep the ocean is. It's almost beyond human comprehension. I can't run down the whole list, but just to give you an inkling, here are some examples of the cuts and their effects. The firing of thousands of federal workers at the IRS is predicted to lead to a 10% drop in tax revenue in the first quarter of 2025 alone. That's $500 billion, roughly 2/3 of the defense budget, less for schools, infrastructure, etc. They cut roughly a quarter of the health and human services workforce. This will affect disease control and occupational safety and health. This goes hand in hand with a 44% budget cut for the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. This will make the US less able to respond to the next pandemic, among other things. Nearly $1 billion was cut from education research. This effectively ends any kind of data collection on what affects kids' performance in schools, including removing digital tools from classrooms that have already been issued. Trump has also issued an executive order instructing the Education Secretary to take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education and return authority over education to the states and local communities. In effect, this means the destruction of public schools in low-income areas, as the federal government sends money to public schools that have many low-income students and students with disabilities. The fallout of the destruction of USAID could fill an encyclopedia, but I'll give you a couple of examples. In Sudan, USAID contributed 44% of the humanitarian assistance before being shut down. This means that all across the country, food kitchens had to close down, leaving millions at the risk of starvation and preventable illness. In South Africa, the now missing funds are estimated to lead to the death of up to 500,000 people over the next decade. In the United States, the medical trials funded by USAID had to be stopped, leaving thousands without medication and with medical devices in their bodies that are now no longer monitored or cared for. And I'm no fan of a lot of stuff USAID does, but this is something that has to be opposed on principle. Doge also stopped all work at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has been established after the 2008 financial crisis, and whose job it is to take the big financial institutions who cheat consumers to court. In doing so, it has returned roughly $21 billion to consumers since its inception. With this, Musk destroyed the law enforcement agency that would monitor financial transactions on X. On housing, rental assistance is cut by $26 billion, heating assistance for low-income households cut by $4 billion, affordable housing resources cut by $1.2 billion, and the list goes on. This will devastate public housing in the United States, including housing for people with disabilities, the elderly, and together with the cuts, the administration budget would halt any rental assistance to able-bodied adults for 2 years. I realize that in my list here, I'm mixing DOGE cuts that have already happened and proposed budget cuts. But this is all part of the same project. Under the new spending bill, the EPA's budget would be cut by over 50%. Recently, the EPA announced the rollback of over 30 regulations limiting air pollution from cars and power plants, restrictions on the emissions of mercury and clean water protections for rivers and streams. The EPA estimated that these regulations being in place would save roughly 200,000 Americans dying of heart, respiratory, and otherwise preventable illnesses over the next 25 years. And these are just deaths, not to mention the amount of non-lethal health problems that will undoubtedly arise from this. The same analysis predicts roughly 100 million asthma attacks more by 2050 in the US alone, and 20,000 emergency room visits for cardiovascular problems. At the same time, the administration is quietly moving to get rid of the bans on forever chemicals and invited companies to email the government to get exemptions to pollute as much as they want. Luckily, there are parts of the government that aren't as easy to dismantle, like Medicare, for instance, a program that keeps 2/3 of all elderly Americans out of poverty. But you don't have to dismantle it to make it not functioning if you fire a significant amount of the people working there. This far, the Trump administration has tried to push out roughly 100,000 federal workers. And with those workers leaving, the institutions they work for will lose an enormous amount of knowledge that is needed to keep the basic government services running. I cannot understate how what I listed here is just the tip of the iceberg. The fallout of this onslaught on the administrative state will echo through generations. This is the two-pronged attack on American democracy we are witnessing right now. What's so paradoxical about this attack is that on the one side, we see a strong state when it comes to the crackdown on civil liberties and disappearing people off the street. On the other side, we see the utter destruction of everything else the state can do. In the past, I was always hesitant on my channel to use the term fascist, partially because I feel like we have an instinctive rejection for that term. The bar for it is set so high that even the fascist regimes of yesterday might not even clear it until they reach their final form in the World War. And on some level, I believe this comes from what the consequence would be from accepting that label. If the United States has a fascist government, what does that mean for me? It's something very uncomfortable to have that historic responsibility thrust upon you. Living in a democracy doesn't require any responsibility, basically. That might be why it's far less controversial to say that the United States 100 years ago, France, the Federal Republic of Germany, and South Korea all are democracies, even though their political systems are so vastly different that a single descriptor doesn't really do them justice. So you wouldn't expect American fascism to look like German fascism given the massively different circumstances between both countries and time periods. And a great example of this is the concept of the worker. German fascism was unable to conquer the laboring classes. They were something that had to be destroyed or subjugated given their socialist convictions. In the United States currently, the lines are drawn at different spots, and this is something historian Enzo Traverso wrote on in his text, Post-Fascism, Fascism as a Transhistorical Concept. The radical right claims the classic populist paradigm of the good people opposed to the corrupted elites, but has significantly reformulated. In the past, the good people meant an ethnically homogeneous rural community opposed to the dangerous classes of the big cities. After the end of communism, a defeated working class struck by deindustrialization has been reintegrated in this virtuous national community. The bad people of post-fascist imagination, immigrants, Muslims, and blacks of the suburbs, veiled women, junkies, and marginal men, are merged with the leisure classes that adopt liberated customs, feminists, LGBTQ, anti-racist, ecologists, and defenders of immigrant rights. On the opposite spectrum, the good people are nationalist, anti-feminist, homophobic, xenophobic, and nourish a clear hostility towards ecology, modern arts, and intellectualism. As Holocaust survivor Primo Levi put it a little bit more succinctly in 1974, every era has its own fascism. But no matter the era, fascism is anti-democracy. And what is obvious to anyone willing to see is that what we are currently seeing in the United States is an attempt to destroy American democracy and the idea of a government that can do anything besides locking you up, kill people overseas, and help corporations and billionaires make as much money as possible. And even though the situations are so vastly different, we can look to other moments in history where there was also an attempt to destroy democracy from the right and draw our conclusions. Here's where we come full circle to the question of America's Weimar moment and whether it's here now. To me, that answer is yes, although not in a way you might think. Looking at Weimar Germany, there were dozens of moments where it could have gone another way. Even in January 1933, the rise of the Third Reich was by no means set in stone. There were so many chances to strengthen and save German democracy that were, for some reason or another, not taken up. German democracy died slowly of 1,000 little cuts rather than some big killing blow. This is also why the passivity I talked about earlier is so frustrating to watch. Each small compromise makes the next slightly larger one seem more acceptable, gradually shifting the boundaries of what is considered tolerable. Reading about the Weimar era for my podcast and going through all those situations where individuals and broader society failed to avert what was about to come, it is really striking that there seems to be one constant that almost all historians point to. A chance that was missed again and again and again, especially in the later years of the Republic. And if you take anything from this video, please let it be this. Anti-democratic movements have to be met every inch of the way. You have to fight them on everything. There is no half measure in trying to preserve a democracy. Either it is preserved or it isn't. So seeing democratic leadership not even be willing to shut down the government when the Trump administration is, again, literally destroying the state apparatus, when they arrest judges and deport legal residents as well as United States citizens, when an unelected billionaire is performing a bust-out on the state. Something that was obvious from a mile away, as you can see in the leaked memo I read to you in the beginning. You might even have seen this coming decades ago, because this isn't a sudden insurgence. This isn't one party brainwashed and captured by radicals. The idea that government is the problem, the idea that religious values should trump civil liberties, unleashing the free market economy within the state. None of this is new in any way. Rather, it's the final form of the Republican project going back decades. Going one step further, when you see that this movement that currently holds all three branches of government cheer, applaud, and chant USA to footage of largely innocent people being put in chains and having their heads shaved, on an emotional level, you feel that this rot cannot be undone by 1, 2, or 3 elections. Even in the best case scenario that Trump is ousted in a couple of years, something akin to a new Reconstruction era is probably the only way for the United States to remain a democracy. Today, if you'll indulge me, I'll leave you with a poem I keep thinking back to recently. A poem I was surprised to find out has never been translated into English. It's called Rathenau by Kurt Tucholsky and is named after the German Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau, who was assassinated in 1922. In his poem, Tucholsky is addressing the Republic, meaning politicians, but also society at large. It's very obvious that the author was very frustrated about the passivity he saw on display in the face of a rising far-right, constantly yielding space to their enemies, letting them seize the initiative. And I apologize in advance for the lack of poetic rhythm in my translation, but this is the best I could come up with. Strike, strike, hit them hard. They all flinch, for there is no man. They are only snipers in hiding. Hold them fast. Your house will burn if you let it smolder now. Tear apart the noose of paragraphs. Don't fall into it. You must succeed. 4 years of slaughter, that is, God knows, enough. You stand before your final breath. Show what you are, judge yourself, die or fight. There is no third choice. Not really sure what to put here for the outro. Probably just some footage I took while riding my motorcycle. That way you'll have something nice to look at while I keep talking. Anyhow, thank you for watching, folks, especially if you have been a subscriber for a longer while, considering how quiet it has been on this channel. Truth be told, I somewhat burned out on political commentary after 2020, and my life is very different now from when I was a full-time content creator. I have a regular job and a family, and the little spare time I do have, I put into the podcast. Listen to our series on the Weimar Republic, by the way. The sequel series should start soon. But one good thing about all of this, I guess, is my renewed enthusiasm for whatever this is. Hopefully I can maintain it for a while and not get disheartened, but I guess that's the challenge for all of us. If you want to support what I do here or on the podcast, you can do so on patreon.com/danarrows. Although I should say that I cannot promise an output anywhere close to what it used to be, considering my other responsibilities. If you still want to support the content that I do manage to put out, I greatly appreciate it. Just know that if there is anything better in your life that you could spend $5 on, you should probably spend it on that instead. Back in the day, I always signed my videos off with "have a good one." That was kind of a staple of mine. But for this new era, I'm gonna switch it up a little and say, stay safe and stay in the fight. Take care.
Oh, that's gross. But it's pink, so I don't think I'll get demonetized.
Hello, fellow kids, and welcome to What is Politics? My name is Daniel, and this is a show where we try to understand politics with the goal of becoming more effective political actors. Today we're going to talk about why the nationalist right, or populist right, seems to be on the rise all over the world right now. People want to know what's happening, and they also want to know why left-wing populist parties aren't getting the same kind of traction. When it comes to the question of why these parties are on the rise, I think the answer is pretty straightforward. Inequality has been exploding for the past 40 years, and life is just getting more and more unaffordable and more insecure. And if you're in a country that has social programs like free healthcare or cheap tuition, those programs have been slowly eroding and slowly falling apart during this whole period. And all of this seems to keep happening no matter who gets elected. And this explosion of inequality and unaffordability has kicked up a fat notch since COVID, so that a lot of these scary trends now seem to be accelerating. So the reason that the far right is on the rise is because people have tried out all of the other mainstream parties over the last few decades, and no matter who gets elected, they all keep steering us in the same general direction. Hope and change didn't deliver, so more and more people are ready to try something new. Angry hope and change. Except, of course, it's not all that new. Nationalist right-wing politicians who promise to protect the working class, but with policies that are also super friendly to big business. That's what the fascists were offering in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, albeit in a much more extreme way. And because fascism led to World War II and the Holocaust and slave camps and death and destruction for millions of people, voters have been afraid to touch right-wing nationalism with a 10-foot pole for decades. And people didn't have very much reason to be interested in it in the first place, because the post-World War II era until the 1980s or so was the most equal and prosperous period in the history of human civilization. Until the last 200 years or so, politics in human civilizations were basically about a tiny elite extracting the maximum wealth out of the vast majority of the population with the help of an authoritarian state. And this only starts to change once you get democracy popping up after the French Revolution. Today, the hell of fascism has been over for 70 years in most countries, and the people who lived through World War II are all gone or on their way out. Meanwhile, the types of people who are accusing the right-wing populists of being fascists and Nazis are often the same people who flushed the prosperity and equality of the post-war decades down the toilet in the first place. They're the ones who shipped all the well-paying jobs to third world sweatshops, and they gutted our social programs and jacked up our tuitions. So their freakouts about fascism aren't super persuasive to most people. Like, if these guys are telling us that nationalism is fascism and fascism is bad, well, then maybe fascism is good. And when you look at what the different political parties have to offer, the mainstream parties have no vision whatsoever for any kind of different future other than just more of the same. Never mind a plan for the future. Very often they're just in denial that anything is happening at all. You'll often hear candidates and pundits and think tanks telling us that things are actually doing great. GDP is up. It's just that people think that they can't afford rent and electricity at the same time because of social media is making them think that they're doing badly. And when it comes to inequality, if candidates mention it at all, they're mostly just barfing out empty slogans about innovation and the knowledge economy. And they tell us that the solution to society becoming more and more like Mad Max each year is that we just need to get more education, and we need to get more skills and adapt to all the new wonderful opportunities out there in the Mad Max economy. Meanwhile, the tuition fees that you need to pay for those skills cost more and more, and no one is even pretending that they're going to do anything about that. Or else we often hear these people tell us that we just need to focus on growing the pie. That way everyone can be more prosperous. We don't need to think about inequality. We just need to think about more pie. And the way that you grow pies is that you give rich people and entrepreneurs more tax breaks and more incentives and less regulations. You free them from the regulations and the restrictions. And then you stand back and let them innovate all over our faces. In other words, the solution to inequality is just more inequality. When someone tells you that the solution to your problems is to give them all your money and let them do whatever they want, that's not a solution, that's a cult. And then, for those of us who do mortgage our mom's organs to get the skills that we need to join the knowledge economy bonanza, it's like, oops, AI is going to do that now. And like, did I tell you to learn to code? Sorry you're in 100,000K debt for nothing. Well, don't just stand there whining about who stole your cheese. Go gamble on crypto and stocks and doggy Trump coin pump and dump schemes. Buy the dip, bro. Have you tried the dip? Why don't you just do what all the successful entrepreneurs do? Just use your inheritance to buy real estate and then milk the peasants. Duh. And learning highly sought after tech skills might help some people if AI doesn't make you obsolete first. But everyone knows that a lot of people, maybe most people, are just not cut out for knowledge economy work. And then the subtext of this type of rhetoric about how everyone just has to get with the knowledge economy is that if you're not made for university, then you're just good for being Soylent Green ingredients for the rest of the people who do have what it takes. Like, no one even gives a shit about you enough to pretend to care about you. Also, if you know how economics works, if everyone in your country suddenly did have the ability and the money to get the best quantum computing degrees or the best medical degrees, you just end up with a country where everyone who's flipping burgers and driving Ubers and sweeping floors has a quantum computing degree or a medical degree, because that's how a market works. You only have so many doctor or quantum computing programmer positions available, and you still need people to sweep the floors and flip the burgers. And then when you have 100 million people competing for every doctor or computer programmer position, those jobs, doctor and computer or quantum computer programmer, those jobs become minimum wage jobs. So all of this shit is a big scam. And what the politicians are basically telling us is, vote for me, and the world will look like Gattaca, Squid, Hunger Games, Mad Max in 30 years, but I can promise you the smoothest ride down the commode. Another thing to notice when you read the papers or you listen to political campaign speeches, not only do the mainstream parties have no vision for the future, they also have no explanation for why Western civilization is slowly going down the Mad Max toilet and why it's impossible to afford a place to live anymore in any major city anywhere in the developed world. And explanations for this stuff seem to be scarce all around. Like, you can watch and listen to 1,000 YouTube videos or podcasts on why inequality is growing, or why healthcare is falling apart, and why housing is so unaffordable everywhere at the same time, or why university fees exploded everywhere at the same time. And it's all just like, well, there's too much regulation on building housing, and the population is aging, and people aren't having enough kids, and that's why we can't afford social programs anymore. And it's just too harmful to the economy to tax the rich, and university administration costs are very high, and there's no clear big picture explanation for anything. Is it just a coincidence that all these things are happening at the same time? And is there just nothing we can do about any of this? But you know who does have an explanation for what's happening? The far right. They have an explanation for what's happening, and they have a vision for the future, and they have a solution for our problems. And their vision for the future, or the one at least that they're selling to people, is more security for workers, more manufacturing jobs, a reversal of the massive deindustrialization that you had in the 1990s and 2000s that created this horrible rust belt in the United States and all these OxyContin addicts, and the steady erosion of the social programs in Europe and Canada. And the nationalist parties also have an explanation for why all of this stuff is happening. They have bad guys to blame for it, and it's the globalists, which in right-wing language means the bad billionaires who pushed for all the free trade agreements that destroyed the middle classes in America and are destroying them in Europe and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and all the rich countries. And these globalists don't care about their own people. They only care about profit, and they only care about people in the third world for some reason. And they bring in a lot of immigrants from the third world to lower the wages of the people in their home countries and to dilute their sense of national solidarity and pride. And the other enemy in this story are the people who are on the side of the globalists, and those are the snotty, elitist, university-indoctrinated liberals who prioritize foreigners and immigrants over Americans or whatever country you're in, because these liberals love feeling that they're morally superior to you, and they hate working-class people, especially white ones. And these woke cancel culture zealots want to get you fired for your job and banned from social media or even debanked for having the wrong opinions or for asking the wrong questions about any number of things like COVID vaccine or trans women in sports or immigration. And in the nationalist universe, this is what's called the left. And the job of the so-called left is to make you feel guilty for being American or British or Hungarian or for being white or for being a man, so that you don't resist all of the social control that these globalists are imposing on you and sending your jobs away and bringing in immigrants to lower your wages and to raise your rents and to turn you into a loser who can't afford rent, never mind to raise a family. And sometimes the bad billionaires and the university and corporate HR cancel freaks are called socialists. And in this vocabulary, socialism is this boogeyman where the bad billionaires and the cancel creeps force middle class and poor people to pay all the taxes, and the government imposes all these regulations on small businesses to prevent them from being competitive with the big guys. So socialism in this world is a way for the big guys to suck at the teat of the government and prevent small guys from coming up and competing with them. And if you're someone who has the time and inclination to go deeper into this stuff, then you usually end up with all these theories about how it's actually the Jews who are the main bad billionaires who are organizing and orchestrating all this. So these globalists and leftists and socialists, they're the black hats, they're the bad guys. And the good guys are the nationalist billionaires And even though the job of a CEO is to keep down costs and make his workers' wages as low as possible, and even though billionaires' profits go down when wages are up, and even though Trump himself has said several times that American wages are too high, somehow these good guy white hat billionaires like Trump want America to go back to the high wages of the 1950s and 1960s and 70s. Except they also want to do this without unions or high taxes, which were a huge part of why wages were so high at the time. The point is that the right wing, the nationalist right wing, has a clear story. And it has an explanation for what happened, and it has good guys and bad guys. And it also has a plan to make it possible for you to afford to have a family and a house and a future and hope again. And that's one big reason why you had more Latinos and black people going for Trump in the US in 2024, even though he's kind of racist in a lot of ways. Think about it. How would you rather live? Would you rather be poor and have no future, except everyone calls you the right pronouns and apologizes for slavery every time they see you and makes a land acknowledgement while never giving you back any of the land of your ancestors? And those same people who are making all these land acknowledgements and are apologizing for being alive and for being white, they'll get you fired if you happen to have the wrong opinions on a whole bunch of issues that they won't even let you have a discussion about. Like, would you prefer that? Or would you rather have some people say or do racist things against you once in a while as you give them the finger while you get in your nice car that you bought with your nice job, and as you drive away to your nice home and your nice family that you can afford now because Trump made America great again? Anti-racism is a joke if it doesn't come together with higher wages and a decent life. And that's what we've been getting from the supposed left-wing parties for the past several decades. Meanwhile, the nationalist right not only has explanations for our problems, and good guys and bad guys, but they also have a solution for the future. And that solution is, you need to put all your faith in a great leader, and this great leader has enough money and power, or at least his friends have enough money and power, so that he can tell the establishment to fuck off. And your role is just to vote for these guys and then cheer on the great leader as he makes your country great again, while the establishment freaks out and screams fascism the whole time. And let me tell you something. Whenever someone tells you that the key to making massive changes in society is just vote and then cheer on for one person or one party without doing anything to get involved beyond that, that's a grift. Elected politicians cannot make giant changes without a giant organized public ready to back them up, while the entire establishment tries to sabotage the politicians from making these changes. As you can tell by now, to me, this nationalist right-wing story is just a giant scam. And the point of this type of nationalist politics is to ask all the right questions, which the mainstream parties are not asking, and then to give you all the wrong answers. It's a phony instruction manual for making your country great again that's telling you that you can fight off the bad guys by pointing a rifle at your own face instead of at the bad guys' faces. So, according to these right-wing nationalists, the problem isn't billionaires and corporations and wealthy people in general who have been reshaping the government and the world in their own interests. It's just the bad billionaires and the woke corporations. And what this story does is that if you're just thinking about woke billionaires and CEOs instead of all billionaires and CEOs, well, then you've been hoodwinked into not understanding that all billionaires and big corporations want your wages to be as low as possible, including the nationalist billionaires like Donald Trump and his buddies. It's a massive bait and switch game to trick you into letting rich people get even richer and to let inequality get even worse. Some businesses want to use Chinese or Mexican workers instead of you. But for other businesses, they want to hire you in your country, but at the lowest wage possible. That's what being a business leader is. Publicly traded corporations do not give a shit about woke or nationalists or anti-woke or anything else besides profits. And it's not because their CEOs are bad people, although many of them are, but it's because that's their fucking job, to care about profits and nothing else, no matter what kind of CEO you are. Super conservative Christian, super liberal, gay, Muslim, doesn't matter at all. That's why 5 seconds after Donald Trump got reelected, The CEOs that were woke yesterday, like Zuckerberg or Bezos, they turned around, put on gold necklaces and sweatpants for some reasons, and they came to bro out with the Big D, and they started smoking on his Jimmy Dean sausage, and praised him and gave money to his inauguration and all that. Some CEOs might be really nice people, and others are monsters, like that healthcare CEO who was murdered in the US. All these articles came out about what a nice guy he was and how he's from a humble background and, oh, what a terrible murder. But all these articles forgot to mention that he was a complete monster on the job. He doubled the rate of insurance rejections for his company from the standard 15% rate for the industry as a whole to 30%. And he invented all these schemes and scams and all these AI programs to deny people healthcare even while they were in the middle of receiving treatments. And tens of thousands of extra people died from these policies. Just recently, Edie Patterson, a really funny comedian who's on The Righteous Gemstones, which is a great show, her mom had her treatments yanked out from under her during her illness. And so Edie Patterson has to go on Instagram and beg everyone to harass the company to let her treatments continue so that her mom could live. And if that mass murdering CEO had not been gunned down in the street, then those horrible policies that he instituted at his company would probably become the industry norm in a few years. Because then all of the other companies, whether their CEOs are nice or not, would have to do the same thing to compete. If you're a CEO and your job requires denying people more healthcare so that they die, and you don't have the stomach for it because you're a nice human being with human feelings, well, you will get fired and replaced by a psychopath who will do it. That's why there's such a disproportionately high number of CEOs who are actual psychopaths. And that's not a joke, you can look that up. And the whole idea of good versus bad billionaires and CEOs is designed to make you stupid, so that you keep your eyes off the prize. While you're focused on the supposedly bad billionaires and liberal politicians, you're not noticing that the good billionaires and nationalist politicians, now they're the ones who are picking your pockets, just as sure as the globalist ones do when they're in power. It's the same pig, but with red, white, and blue lipstick on instead of rainbow lipstick. Even nice guy CEO billionaires who work in industries where they don't have to kill your grandma as part of their job, they still live in CEO zillionaire world, and they understand all the problems of the world from the vantage point of a CEO billionaire. From their point of view, wages are always too high, and workers are always too lazy, because their goal is to make more profits, and your humanity is in the way. And from the worker's point of view, well, wages are always too low, and the boss always wants us to work non-stop for as little as possible with no regard for our lives. And these are just fundamental to the position of being a worker or being an owner. And we have this fake idea that good government and good political leadership is supposed to be about balancing out all the needs and points of view of all these different actors in our society, landlords and tenants, bosses and workers, and we're supposed to try to find the best policies that benefit society as a whole. But we have this idea because our education system is so bad, and our media is owned by corporations and run by CEOs who want us to be stupid. In the real world, representative democratic politics is an arena of combat, where forces with opposing interests battle it out. The landlord pushes his point of view. Rents should be as high as possible. And the tenant pushes his point of view. Rents should be as low as possible. And they do this by lobbying and propaganda, by pressure tactics, by donations, by letters, by harassing representatives, by making protests, by doing strikes, by riots, by persuading the population, by voting, and sometimes by actual violence. And the results of this combat are the laws which are passed by the state. And that's why we have so many laws where we have time off, we have paid overtime, we have public healthcare systems, we have so many lovely things in our wonderful, wealthy societies because people fought for them once upon a time. But because the balance of power today is so skewed in favor of people with wealth and property, and because the general public isn't organized and isn't active anymore and isn't applying any pressure, it's always the landlord's point of view, or the boss's point of view, and especially the billionaire's point of view, that determine what these policies are going to be for everyone. Politics is an arena of combat, but the public isn't showing up to the fight, and so the corporations and CEOs are just winning by default. And the only reason that politicians aren't destroying our civilization faster is that politicians are afraid to cut a lot of these things, are afraid to make things worse too fast, because people will flip out and then vote them out of office. So it kind of just always happens slowly and in a way that's confusing. You don't really see what's happening. All this stuff is just the ABCs of politics and of economics. But because our education system is so bad, And because the CEO controlled media so bad, we're in a position where we're so ignorant and confused that large numbers of people are able to be convinced that there's some kind of difference between woke globalist CEOs and patriotic nationalist CEOs. Another thing we don't learn is that ever since nationalism emerged in the 1800s, it has always been used as a scam by wealthier people to trick poor people into supporting policies that benefit the rich people. In the 1800s, it was the era of the Industrial Revolution, where governments and wealthy business owners were tossing independent farmers and tradesmen out into the slums so that you and your 4-year-old kids could work in the factories and mines 15 hours a day for starvation wages. And as people started organizing labor unions and socialist parties to fight this stuff, the business class learned that they could use nationalism to deflect and confuse all the anger away from themselves and onto other people. And at that time, those other people were Jews and poor foreigners. And the nationalists would tell the farmers and workers, we're all in the same boat. Us good Christian nationalist billionaires and nobility and business owners, and you good Christian workers and farmers and tradesmen, we want what's best for you. But those awful alien labor unions and socialists and Jews and foreigners, they're turning our society upside down. And it's the greedy Jewish billionaires and foreign billionaires that are throwing you out of your factories, not us nice Christian billionaires. And we'll protect you from those bad guys. And today, those foreigners are Mexicans or Syrians or dark-skinned refugees from around the third world. But back then, the foreigners were the French, or the English, or the Irish, or Scots, or Germans, or Slovaks, whatever the neighboring country was, all the poor white people. Because it doesn't matter who the enemy is, or what color or religion they are, as long as that enemy isn't inequality, or the fact that rich people have too much power, and that they're using it for themselves at your expense. And all this nationalism crap is a huge part of why World War I happened. People had been getting whipped up with these nationalist ideas for several decades, and their governments were able to use that mindset to suck the publics in the various countries of Europe into an idiotic war over nothing. And it ended up causing millions of deaths and slaughter for no reason. And then again in the 1920s and 1930s, with the Great Depression, we were in a situation that was a little bit like today, except it was much worse at that time. People were angry at the failures of the world economic system and of their political systems, and they were joining labor unions and socialist parties, and a lot of people were worried about some of the failures of socialism and socialist parties in Russia and the authoritarianism there, and they were afraid of those kind of forces taking over the democratic countries. And again, the nationalists said, well, it's the foreigners and the Jewish billionaires and the foreign and Jewish labor organizers and communists causing all of this, not the good German zillionaires. And German zillionaires and bosses and workers and tenants and farmers were all just one happy family. Don't think about how when your wages go up, my profit goes down, or when your rent goes up, my profit goes up. All we need to do is just drive out all the foreign influences and make Germany great again. And in order to do this, we need to get rid of all this stupid, evil democracy. Democracy, which in the real world is the only tool that workers and farmers and ordinary people have that they can use to unite and become powerful enough to fight the power and the wealth of the billionaires. That's why the billionaires and the fascists and the nationalists hate democracy and always have. Now, there's a popular expression about history that comes from Karl Marx. He said that great historical figures and events will appear in history twice. The first time as tragedy, and then as farce. Well, the first time the populist right wing came to power, it was World War and Holocaust and huge tragedy. But at the same time, Hitler and Mussolini came from working class and lower middle class backgrounds. They were both war veterans and had lived through the brutalities of World War I. They had some connection to the greater public. Now, their nationalism unleashed horrors on the world, but it was an attempt to transform society in radical ways that they thought would end the problems and the economic and political chaos of the early 20th century. But today, so many of these new nationalist politicians are just rich guys who faced zero adversity in their lives, and they're using nationalism just to make themselves richer. They're tapping into the anti-elite politics, but they are themselves the elites. And their politics are just angry baby politics. These are adult rich kids who are angry because they grew up getting everything they wanted as kids. But as adults, they're not getting everything they want anymore. They have to pay taxes. They have to obey regulations. And they have restrictions on how much they can exploit their employees. Trump had the richest man in the whole world, Elon Musk, sniffing around trying to cut out waste in the American government. Now, Musk was drooling to cut Social Security pension checks for old people, and 40% of old people in the US depend on these checks to live. And he was talking about Social Security as a Ponzi scheme and we should just get rid of it. But Social Security is just too popular to cut it. So instead, Musk cut a bunch of funding and jobs from the agency that administers and distributes these social checks. So now it's just going to be a lot harder for old people to get their checks or to get help with them if they have a problem. So he's going to reduce the number of people that are getting these checks without actually reducing the amount of the checks. Meanwhile, the big policy that Trump will most likely be able to pass, because the entire business class has a giant boner about it, is this giant tax cut. And this tax cut is going to cost more than the Iraq War. And it's going to blow an enormous hole in the budget and annual deficit. So these two zillionaires are basically trying to do an Iraq war against your grandma and your grandpa. And they're going to put the country into massive debt, also that they can steal food out of your grandma's mouth and shove it down their own grubby little chocolate-smeared pie holes. These people are so fucking rich that if you hacked into their bank accounts and their stock portfolios and you erased 90% of their wealth, they wouldn't even notice it for the rest of their lives, because it wouldn't even affect their lifestyles in the least, because no human being could possibly use that much money or even know that they have that much money. And this insane tax cut has two giant benefits for the rich. Number one is obvious. Rich people will pay less taxes. But the number two is that in the future, if someone like Bernie or AOC gets elected and they want to do something like make a taxpayer-funded healthcare program, then all of the corporate-funded Republicans and Democrats and the CEO-controlled media, they'll all say, "Oh no, we can't do that. We have an enormous budget deficit and national debt that we have to pay off. And we have to use every penny of our taxes to pay off the debt, not to do anything good for anybody. Sorry, learn to code. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Get an inheritance." And that's one reason that whenever Republicans get elected in the United States, they always massively increase the debt and deficit with Iraq wars and tax cuts and Afghanistan wars and all sorts of totally fiscally idiotic policies. Their reputation for being fiscally responsible debt hawks is entirely a fake news propaganda festival which is kept alive by the CEO-controlled media. In reality, these supposedly conservative politicians, they only worry about deficits and debts when elected officials want to spend money on anything that benefits you. When it comes to rich people enriching themselves, they love deficits. Instead of cutting massive waste, fraud, and abuse from the military budget, where defense contractors will bill $1,000 for a toilet seat, they're going to add $150 billion to the military budget. And the reason that the military budget never gets cut is that the military in the US is taxpayers paying taxes, goes to the Pentagon. The Pentagon does all of the scientific research at your expense, and then they give it away to all these corporations. So the Pentagon is a giant teat that the corporations are milking at. That's the biggest secret of why the Pentagon budget never goes down, because every super mega rich person in America is making money from this waste. Or look at Trump's tariff policies. There's been a lot of discussion about how every aspect of the tariff seems to be completely insane. Like, why is he imposing tariffs on an island with only penguins on it? Or why isn't he phasing in the tariffs gradually so that American industries have time to adapt to them? And why are these tariffs just like based on random nonsense? And everyone is like, oh, he's acting so crazy. What's he trying to do? Is this a genius master negotiating plan? Or is he just a complete drooling imbecile? And I think both of these things are true. It's an idiotic, incompetent plan to scare the world into negotiating better deals for the US. But the tariffs and the strategy and the incompetence of it make a lot more sense if you think about class and about who Trump is and how people like him and his class see the world. Trump is a CEO and a zillionaire. CEOs and zillionaires don't want to pay taxes. They want you to pay all the taxes, and they want to use the taxes that you pay to subsidize their businesses, to give them government contracts, to get special subsidies and grants, to have the Pentagon pay for all the research, and then to give them all the results. And they want the government to protect them from smaller upstart competitors and innovators. All that stuff in this stupid nationalist versus globalist paradigm that the nationalists say that the socialists want to do, that's everything that all billionaires and CEOs want to do, whether they are woke or anti-woke or whatever. And Trump isn't just any CEO or zillionaire. He is a born rich kid, and he never had to work for anyone else a day in his life. So Trump's plan is to return the US economy to the types of tax systems and structures that you had in civilizations all over the world before democracy started forcing rich people to pay into the system. And I'm not just making this up. Trump has said himself that America was much better in the McKinley era, when most taxes were paid through tariffs instead of income taxes. And he's also straight up said several times that he'd love to just get rid of the income tax entirely and replace it with tariffs. And tariffs are like sales taxes. They're taxes added onto the price of imported goods. So, like sales tax, the poorer you are, the bigger percent of your income you pay. Because poor people spend all their money every month on staying alive, and rich people save huge chunks of their money. And when they spend it, they use most of it to buy assets and stonks and things where you don't have to pay sales tax. What this means is that it will be the poor and middle class people who pay most of the taxes. And also this McKinley era that he's always talking about, that he wants to bring the country back to, it did have a lot of manufacturing jobs, but those were not the well-paying manufacturing jobs in the 1950s, where a man with a high school diploma could go work at a factory and raise a family on one income while mom stayed at home with the kids. No. The McKinley era manufacturing jobs were horrible starvation wage jobs, where you and your kids worked 15 hours a day with no rights, and very little pay. And if you went on strike, then the police or the private police would come and shoot you. This was the Gilded Age of zillionaires, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. And they were building company towns to put manufacturing workers into virtual slavery. And the rich had everything and everyone else had nothing. And this is where we've been going back to in slow motion for the past 40 years. But Trump is a greedy boy. He's a rich kid who's used to getting what he wants. And like Francis in Pee-wee's Big Adventure, what he wants is your bike and your car and your house, and your money, and your wife, and he wants his Hassenpfeffer, and he wants it right now. I see a lot of people like this in my work. I'm a lawyer for tenants, and I see a lot of landlords like this. Their parents were middle class, or they were immigrants who saved up money from working, and then they bought buildings, and they made a bunch of money, and they're usually like run-of-the-mill greedy landlords, but they stay within the law most of the time, and they're not terrible. But then, 40 years later, they croak, and their spoiled monster cartoon children take over. People like Trump, who are born rich. And when these people take over, they are like cartoon villains. They're used to just getting whatever they want, and they have no enjoyment of life beyond just making more money and status. So when they take over all these buildings, they just ignore all the laws, and they go on a total rampage. They flood tenants' apartments on purpose. They threaten them. They do all kinds of insane, crazy schemes to chase them out of their apartments so they can jack up the rents and flip the buildings and rack up as much money as possible as quickly as possible. And with these landlords, for a while, they get away with this stuff because everyone's shocked and most people don't know how to deal with that kind of tyrannical bullying from their landlord. But eventually, tenants start to get organized and they learn their rights and they call me and then they resist. And then all of the landlord insanity and bullying kind of blows up in their faces because now the tenants are suing them and they're calling the city on them, and these landlords are now paying fines and they're getting their names in the newspapers and the courts are blocking their projects. And that's what I see with this Donald Trump and a lot of these rich kid nationalist right-wingers. And the irony and tragedy and farce of it all is that he's using your anger and your fear at growing inequality and the growing power of the wealthy to accelerate that growing inequality into warp speed. And people fall for it because we don't know any better. Our political education is garbage, and that's why I started this channel. But the silver lining in all this is that none of these right-wing parties are going to do anything about inequality. And soon, in many countries, the nationalist right will be discredited, just like all the other parties and movements that don't deliver on their promises of hope and change. And in the US, if Trump doesn't succeed in turning the US into a total police state, like he's trying to do with some of these crazy deportation lawsuits that we'll talk about next time, he probably will fall flat on his face and discredit right-wing nationalism in the US for a little while at least. And that means that there will be an opening for people to try something else that's new. Like maybe the populist left, which in my opinion has a proper explanation for what's happening and has some solutions that would actually do something about inequality. Except the left currently is in no position to take power or achieve anything if it does in the United States and in many other countries as well. And we need to understand why that is so that we can do something about it. So that's the question I'm going to be asking and answering next time. If people are so hungry for change, why are they choosing the fake populist, fake anti-establishment right instead of the populist left? And another huge question that we need to answer. Why is it that for the last 40 years, no matter who gets elected, left, right, and center, they all keep delivering the same piss in different bottles? More and more inequality. And what can we do about any of this? Until then, please like and subscribe, and if you have any money to help keep me alive, please send me some via the links in the show notes. I don't monetize my channel for a whole bunch of reasons, so I really do rely on you to survive, and I am a lawyer, but I work part-time so that I can do this, and I also do the kind of law that brings in the least possible money. And check out my other videos. They will blow your mind and help you understand the world, like I explain where male dominance comes from, or why all the supposedly communist countries have always been dictatorships, or what the terms left and right actually mean in politics. And right now I'm in the middle of a massive series on aspects of the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which no one on either side wants us to know about. So have some fun with that, learn some stuff, send me some money, and until next time, see ya! Hello, fellow kids, and welcome back to What is Politics? For the past few episodes, we've been talking about the political left and right, which refers to the political forces that promote equality versus the political forces that promote hierarchy. In other words, class conflict. Conflict between the different ranks of the various political, economic, cultural, and international hierarchies that structure our social and political worlds. Over the next couple of episodes, we're going to do some political anthropology and look at where human hierarchy comes from. Why are there societies where some people have more resources, more rights, and more decision-making power than others? Why are there societies where men dominate women? Have there ever been any societies where everyone was equal? And if so, why and how? Is the left-wing dream of human political equality something that is possible, or is it forever doomed to fail because hierarchy is so deep in our lobster, chimpanzee, monkey man DNA, or because conditions make it impossible? As we'll see, hierarchy and equality are all about bargaining power. Who has it, who knows they have it, and who knows how to use it. If we look around us today, we find a world full of hierarchies. We have political hierarchies, where some people give orders and others take orders. Owners over employees, government over citizens, masters over slaves. We have economic hierarchies, where some people have extraordinary wealth, and others are destitute and starving. We have cultural hierarchies, where some culturally determined categories of people have more rights or power than other categories of people. Men over women, white over black, Hutu over Tutsi, Tutsi over Hutu. And we have international or interpolity hierarchies, where some countries or tribes or political units dominate others. And all of these hierarchies intertwine with each other and reinforce each other in different ways. Having more wealth gives you more power to boss more people around. Being part of a privileged cultural category or an imperial nation gives you more access to wealth, and being a member of a subjugated one prevents you from accessing as much wealth, or sometimes even prevents you from having any wealth at all. When we look at history, we see the same state of affairs, an endless variety of hierarchies, kings over lords over serfs, patricians over plebeians, masters over slaves, pharaohs, Aztec emperor gods, and the Führer over everyone else. Even when we look at societies which were supposed to be founded on the basis of equality, like the former USSR, China, Cuba, Vietnam, and all the defunct 20th century communist countries, we just see variations of the same political, economic, cultural, and international hierarchies. Communist Party Secretary General over the nomenklatura, over lower-ranking party members, over non-party members. Atheists over religious people, urban people over peasants, bosses over workers, with corresponding hierarchies of income and pay. The Soviet Union over satellite countries. Looking at all this, we would get the impression that human beings are naturally hierarchical animals, that hierarchy is deep in our genes, like the lobsters that Dr. Professor Jordan Peterson likes to talk about. Lobsters aren't a very useful comparison, because they're so distantly related to us. But if we look at our closest relatives, our closest great ape cousins, gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos, we see that they're all organized into hierarchies. Among chimpanzees and gorillas, strong aggressive males dominate the rest of the group, along with coalition allies, including importantly their moms. And all the members of the community can be ranked in some way, which determines who gets access to various resources, including coercive sex. Among bonobos, it's coalitions of females who dominate, and they use a combination of sex and violence to maintain their positions and to control access to resources. Given that all of our closest cousins are organized in this way, primatologists, anthropologists, and archaeologists assume that our earliest common ancestor must have also been organized into some form of dominance hierarchy. But something interesting happened between when we branched off from the common ancestor of our great ape cousins and when we became anatomically modern humans. Because when we look at societies of human beings around the globe today, or in recorded history, who practice the same type of hunting and gathering that most of our ancestors practiced for most of our existence as a species, we see that every single one of these societies shares a distinct lack of social dominance hierarchies. In fact, they seem to lack any kind of hierarchy at all. There are no fixed authority positions, no kings or chiefs or high priests that anyone is forced to obey. Men don't even dominate women, and parents exert only light authority over their children, if any. These societies show an astonishing level of political, economic, and gender equality, alongside a very high level of personal liberty, a combination that's supposed to be impossible, according to 20th century political science theorists steeped in Cold War ideology. In 1634, Father Paul Lejeune, a Jesuit missionary, famously wrote about his encounters with the Montagnais and the Scapi people, some of whom are now known as the Innu, and who live in what is now Quebec and Labrador, in Canada. On their political organization, he noted, quote, "They have neither political organization, nor offices, nor dignities, nor authority, for they only obey their chief through good will toward him. All the authority of their chief is in his tongue's end, for he is powerful insofar as he is eloquent. And even if he kills himself talking and haranguing, he will not be obeyed unless he pleases the savages. Also, as they are contented with a mere living, not one of them gives himself to the devil to acquire wealth." Unquote. Note that the term chief is Lejeune's. The Montagnais and the Scapi had no such rank. Meanwhile, on personal liberty, Lejeune remarked with great irritation, quote, "They imagine that they ought by right of birth to enjoy the liberty of wild-ass colts, rendering no homage to anyone whomsoever, except when they like. Their life is passed in eating, laughing, and making sport of each other, and of all the people that they know. If I questioned them about one thing, they told me about something else, only to get something to laugh and jest about, and consequently I could not know when they were speaking seriously or when they were jesting." Unquote. These descriptions, the lack of authority, the lack of interest in wealth accumulation, and the broad individual personal liberty, even the joking and teasing, taking the piss out of the stodgy missionary anthropologist, can be found in ethnographies about hunter-gatherer societies of a particular type right up until today, who live in territories all across the world. And we also find other traits common to these societies, which Lejeune remarked on elsewhere in his account about the Montagnais and the Scapi, such as their creative intelligence and their restraint when it came to anger, which he very much admired, or else their sexual libertinism and lack of male domination, which bothered him to no end. 300 plus years later, and thousands of miles away, you can read ethnographies or articles about the Mbudi who live in the Ituri rainforest in Central Africa, or the Juhwanzi of the Kalahari Desert, or the Hadza of the Tanzanian savannah, or the Batek who live in the Malaysian rainforest, or the Malapantaran and Palian and Nayaka who live in the forest of southern India. And you'll see the same sorts of stories reported over and over. Extreme political and economic egalitarianism, lack of political authority, lots of humor, and lots of individual personal liberty. Now, what all these cultures share in common, on top of these cultural traits, is that they all practice the same kind of subsistence economy, a specific form of hunting and gathering that anthropologist James Woodburn called immediate return hunting and gathering, which means that people mostly consume what they hunt and gather without processing or storing it in some elaborate way, like smoking or fermenting fish, or drying fruits and pickling vegetables to be eaten in the winter. Immediate return foraging, and foraging is another word for hunting and gathering, is the simplest form of hunting and gathering, a more complicated variation of the foraging that our great ape cousins do. And as such, it's probably what most human beings practice since before we were anatomically modern human beings, up until the Neolithic Revolution, which started about 12,000 years ago and totally changed humanity. So why is it that people who practice this particular type of economy all seem to share so many cultural traits across great distances from each other in wildly different environments? If you think about it, it shouldn't be too surprising that people who do similar things for a living would have similar traits. This is something that we see all around us in our daily lives. Most fine sculptors and surgeons have a lot of patience, steady hands, and an eye for detail. Successful waiters and waitresses tend to be really friendly and have good memories. A lot of lawyers and CEOs are psychopaths. All of these phenomena occur for obvious material and practical reasons, which are inherent to the nature of those particular occupations. And in the same way that there's something inherent to these professions that selects for certain traits and that incentivizes people who want to succeed in those professions to adopt those winning traits, there's something inherent about different types of subsistence economies that select for and incentivize certain cultural and even physical traits. After all, different subsistence economies are very much like different professions. Anyone who engages in immediate return foraging for a living is engaging in the same general type of activity as someone else who's doing it, even if certain details differ. Think of office culture, for example. There are cajillions of office jobs, with several zillion office workplaces, and each workplace has its own culture, but there are some general features that are found in the cultures of most office workplaces. Whether it's a hip and cool horizontal wannabe tech place with swings and pogos and meditation pods, or whether it's a dystopian cubicle fluorescent light Tony as he gets a job call center purgatory. Most people who work in offices, outside of high executive positions, tend to be very conflict averse and reticent to speak their minds, or to act out on their emotions, at least at work. And that's because if you're the type of person who doesn't watch what you say, then you have a tendency to get fired in these sorts of environments. You have a group of people trapped together like sardines all day, and tensions are often bubbling, but actual direct conflict will disrupt production and profit making, which is the reason why everyone is there. Managers don't want the headache of having to deal with everyone's disruptive feelings or with conflicts. So if you can't keep your feelings to yourself, it's easier just to fire you, unless you're really important to the company. So if you're an ebullient, speak your mind type of person in an environment like this, you'll soon either get fired or learn how to shut up. As a result, offices are notorious for being cesspools of passive aggression. And we have many funny takes on this aspect of office culture in TV sitcoms and movies and newspaper comic strips. Similarly, in societies where social harmony and cooperation are essential to survival, like in hunter-gatherer bands, where the wrong kind of conflict at the wrong time of year can potentially lead to collapse of the band and hunger for everyone, you will usually see a huge emphasis on restraining anger and on avoiding conflict. Father Lejeune characterized the Montagnier Nascapi attitude towards anger by recounting how the local shaman once told him, quote, "Nothing can disturb me. Let hunger oppress me. Let my nearest relation pass to the other life. Let the Iroquois, our enemies, massacre our people. I never get angry." Unquote. And Lejeune further noted that in all his time with the Montagnier and Nascapi, he only ever once heard someone say the word for "I am angry." And after that, the rest of the group kept their eyes on that person for some time, for fear of a potential outburst. And you can read similar accounts about restraint of anger in the ethnographies of most immediate return foragers, and also in ethnographies about other types of societies where conflict is an existential threat. Jean Briggs's book, Never in Anger, about her time with the Inuit, who practice a different type of hunting and gathering, is a classic that deals with this theme. So lesson 1 from all this is that the practical conditions that we find ourselves in affects our behavior and our values, in that they push us towards certain kinds of behaviors and away from others. And they also select for certain types of behaviors and values and against others. Selection meaning people who have those values or behavior do better than the people who don't. They survive longer, they have more kids, or they keep their job if we're talking about a work environment, while those who don't die off or get fired. Our environment doesn't determine every choice that every person makes, but it does push us in certain directions, making certain choices much more likely than others, particularly over the long term. If it's minus 20 degrees outside and you need to leave the house, you're totally free to choose to wear anything that you own, or nothing at all, but I can bet that you're going to choose to put on your warmest coat and boots, and not your bikini. Cannibalism is quite rare in Europe, but in times of famine, it predictably goes up. So back to immediate return hunter-gatherers. We saw what incentivizes them to restrain their anger, but what is it about their economy that incentivizes people towards extreme egalitarianism and towards a high degree of personal liberty? If we take a quick look at the logistics of immediate return foraging, the answers are pretty straightforward. Immediate return foraging involves small bands of about 10 to 100 people who make temporary camps for a few weeks, during which they build shelters, socialize, go off and pick berries and fruits and nuts and other wild edibles, and they hunt small animals or fish that they eat on the spot or bring back to share with their families. Hunting large animals is a major part of nomadic foraging life, and the band's nomadic migration patterns are usually based on following the migration patterns of favored game animals. The type of hunting that each culture engages in depends on their environment. So for example, among the Hadza, who hunt around the Serengeti Plains in East Africa. Or among the Kalahari Desert Bush people, you have small groups of men under the age of 40 who hunt with bows and poison arrows and spears. Among the Mbudi in the Ituri rainforest, you have communal net hunting, where men, women, and sometimes even children participate all together. Cooperation is key to survival in all sorts of ways, as people depend on each other to help build their shelters, to watch their kids, and to hunt large game, among other things. And in all of these groups, the meat from large game animals is always shared among the entire band community, no matter who does the hunting. After a time, once most of the good food in the area has been eaten, or the game has moved out of hunting range, the group will decide to move on to a different location. The decision of where to go is made more or less by consensus. People discuss it and make their case and argue, and then eventually the group makes a choice and goes. If there's anyone who really refuses to go along, they can form a splinter band and go somewhere else if they have enough joiners to form a viable band. Or else they can go join another existing group where they have friends or relatives. Splitting up is relatively easy in certain parts of the year, when bands are bigger and closer together, but it can be much more dangerous during the time of year when bands are smaller and further apart, as you're more likely to be a burden to a new band, and too many people leaving a band can end up making it too small to remain viable. The composition of each band may or may not have a core nucleus of people, but in general, it's always in flux, as people leave to join or visit bands with friends and family, or to avoid conflicts with people that they don't like, or else they might come join for the same reasons. And these patterns of flux and splitting and merging with other bands, depending on the season or proclivities of the individual members, are called fission-fusion social grouping. People will also engage in trade and exchange with neighboring non-hunter-gatherer cultures for things like agricultural foods and metal tools that they don't produce themselves. And although they may exchange for agricultural foods, and they know how to produce agricultural foods, what defines them as hunter-gatherers is that they don't engage in any regular agriculture themselves. So based on this, why is there so much political equality and liberty in societies that practice this sort of economy? And note that, like I mentioned in episode 4 and 5, contrary to Cold War propaganda, liberty is not the opposite of equality. Liberty and equality usually go hand in hand. Because if everyone has an equal say, then no one is bossing anyone around, so there is more freedom. And if you don't have liberty, it means that someone is controlling what you're doing from above, which means you have some kind of hierarchy and not equality. That's why democratic countries are more free than dictatorships are. And that's why the famous slogan of the French Revolution was liberty, fraternity, equality. Well, the reason that there's so much political equality and so much liberty in these societies is that given the practical realities of the conditions that they live in, there's simply no way for any person or coalition of people to really dominate anyone else, even if they wanted to. If one of your bandmates are getting annoying or domineering, you can just leave or join another band most of the time. And since the band is always moving around, there's no way to hoard or defend resources. And even if there were some way to hoard things, there's really nothing much to store or to hoard in the first place, because anything that people really need can be found or made or acquired in exchange by more or less anyone, or with cooperation with some friends, with the exception of large game, which usually only certain people are physically strong enough or skilled enough to acquire. In other words, there's just no way to make anyone dependent on anyone else, which is what you need to have a proper hierarchy. Your boss tells you what to do at work all day and not the other way around because you depend on him for your salary. When you're a kid, your parents tell you what to do because you depend on them for food and shelter and love. So then why don't good hunters or coalitions of good hunters leverage the meat that they bring in to dominate other people into doing things for them? Why do hunters divide up their kills among the whole community according to careful, culturally determined rules, instead of exchanging it for favors and services and special treatment? Well, first of all, people love big game meat, but they aren't dependent on it for survival most of the time. So people don't have to tolerate that kind of behavior. Plus, since even the best hunter requires the cooperation of others for all sorts of things, like building shelter or helping with childcare or help with hunting and other things, his bandmates could retaliate by refusing to cooperate with him in all sorts of ways that would undermine his ability to function. And then, on top of these material reasons, there are social and cultural pressures that fill in the gaps and keep things on track. If good hunters were constantly testing out the limits of how much they can get away with dominating people, this would result in having people constantly retaliating against them, which would disrupt group cooperation with potentially disastrous consequences. So there are various cultural mechanisms to encourage sharing and cooperation and to discourage dominance behavior. Anthropologist Richard Lee famously discovered one of these mechanisms when he tried to impress the band of Kalahari Juhuansi that he had been living with by buying them what he thought would be an amazing gift, a seemingly enormous giant meat ox to be shared and eaten at an upcoming Christmas feast.
But to his shock, when he showed off the ox to his hosts, instead of them thanking him for it, everyone in the band took turns insulting it, making jokes about it and laughing at him and his failure of a gift. One woman exclaimed, "Do you expect us to eat that bag of bones?" "What did you expect us to eat off it, the horns?" To much laughter. Later on, a young man sat him down one-on-one and asked him, "Are you too blind to tell the difference between a proper cow and an old wreck?" And another time, an old man came up to him and asked him angrily, "Do you honestly think that you can serve meat like that to people and avoid a fight? With such a small quantity of meat to distribute, how can you give everybody a fair share?" Lee realized that this could be a big problem, as he'd seen very tense moments and occasional arguments break out over meat distribution before, especially when there wasn't enough to go around to everyone's satisfaction. Over the course of the next few days, Lee dealt with incessant interventions like this, people telling him he got ripped off, people complaining out loud that the feast was ruined because of him, that people will be fighting for the scraps, that no one will have enough energy to dance, and that everyone will go to bed hungry. But Lee was confused. This was a really huge-ass meat ox. How could everyone be so dissatisfied with it? One of his informants, an excellent hunter Tommaso, explained to him that although the ox was big, what Bushmen really love is fat, and that most of the sides of that ox was just giant bones, and that he should have bought a smaller, fatter ox, but that now it was too late, and they would just have to make do with some ox soup. All of this made Lee feel like he had screwed up so badly that it might be a good idea for him just to leave the camp permanently and start over somewhere else. But then, when they finally slaughtered and started cutting the animal, Lee saw that contrary to what everyone had been telling him, the ox was actually full of layers and layers of fat. When he frantically tried to point this out to one of the band members, the man yelled back at him, "You call that fat? This wreck is thin, sick, dead." After which he bursted out laughing, like literal rolling around on the ground laughing. Lee stood there totally confused, as the hunters, whose faces seemed totally delighted, and who were packing up huge pieces of meat with big satisfied smiles on their faces, were all the while commenting about how scrawny and useless the meat was, and how bad Lee's judgment was. A few days later, he finally worked up the guts to ask some of his more trusted informants what the hell was going on. And he was told that the way that he had proudly announced his gift to everyone was considered to be an extremely arrogant faux pas, and they were simply responding in the appropriate manner by taking him down a few notches and putting him back in his place. He was then educated on the socially appropriate way that a good hunter is supposed to announce a big kill, basically by apologizing for having done such a bad job. And he was explained how the Juhuanzi constantly tease each other and take each other down in this way to keep everyone level-headed. As Tommaso, the skilled young hunter, put it to him, when a young man kills much meat, he comes to think of himself as a chief or a big man, and he thinks of the rest of us as his servants or his inferiors. We cannot accept this. We refuse one who boasts, for someday his pride will make him kill somebody. So we always speak of his meat as worthless. This way we cool his heart and make him gentle. And when Lee irately asked him why he hadn't told him this before, Tommaso simply replied, "You never asked me." The fact that these sorts of mechanisms exist in the first place suggests that there is a human tendency to dominate, which must be countered by culture. And that's what much of culture is, finding ways to counter disruptive impulses, and to encourage ones that maintain the smooth continuity of the existing social order. But there's one more important piece of the puzzle as to why big aggressive bully hunters don't dominate, and why they don't join in coalition with others like themselves to tyrannize their bandmates. After all, big Chad silverback gorillas and alpha chimpanzees dominate their bandmates just by attacking them and terrorizing them until they accept their alpha status, and high-ranking bonobo females rule by coalition. And if an annoyed chimpanzee or bonobo goes off to join another band, they'll just find a different bully or coalition dominating them over there, and they'll also find themselves at the bottom rung of a new hierarchy. So why doesn't this happen with human hunter-gatherer bands? Part of the answer is the cultural leveling mechanisms that we looked at, and other cultural practices and values. Another part is that human forager groups have a greater need for smooth cooperation than most ape groups do. But another key part of the answer is just good old-fashioned murder. If someone really gets out of hand and starts doing things that disrupts the harmony of band life, or just pisses anyone off beyond a certain point, the disruptive person can relatively easily be murdered, thanks to the existence and ubiquity of lethal weapons, and of poisons available to men and women alike. Even the skinniest, scrawniest person can kill the biggest, most belligerent maniac from a safe distance with a spear, or an arrow, or a poisoned dart. According to anthropologists, once our Homo ancestors developed some of these kinds of weapons, starting with either Homo erectus or Homo habilis, as far back as 2 million years ago, obnoxious alpha bullies would slowly get killed off on a regular basis, therefore weeding out aggressive physical and behavioral dominance traits that previously made alpha male chads the cock of the walk, and which made social dominance hierarchy the order of the day. So instead of getting you more sex, food, babies, and more fun, being an aggressive bully just got you a spear in the head or a poisoned dart in your fool ass. And we can see the results of this clearly in the archaeological record, in the evolution of male bodies. You can think of evolution as an ongoing sculpture session, with the Grim Reaper as the sculptor, and his scythe of death as the chisel, and successive generations as his medium. Around the time that projectile weapons developed, all of the traits that make Macho Man Chad alpha bullies successful in great apes and other animals, like giant canines to scare off or attack competitors, thick brow ridges to protect your face from blows from your competitors' fists, large male body size versus the size of females to help you fight off male sex competitors. These traits start phasing out completely until we get to our modern form with our tiny, weak, girly canines and our wimpy Pee-wee Herman brow ridges, and our pathetic 15% larger males than females on average, compared to the over 100% larger male to female size of our real man, Chad, gorilla, and orangutan cousin kings. Basically, the alpha bullies repeatedly got killed off by their peers, and those traits got progressively weeded out, until we reached our current form 300,000 years ago or so. And when we look at immediate return hunter-gatherers today, we see this exact same dynamic at work. Men who are aggressive, domineering, and who repeatedly cause too many fights and too much disruption will sometimes get murdered by an enemy, or their relatives will passively fail to defend them when they're ambushed by their enemies, or else in extreme cases, they will suffer capital punishment at the hands of the entire community. Richard Lee describes a rare occurrence where the entire community ambushed and killed a disruptive 3-time murderer in broad daylight. Quote, "As he lay dying, all the men fired at him with poison arrows until he looked like a porcupine. Then, after he was dead, all the women, as well as the men, approached the body and stabbed him with spears, symbolically sharing the responsibility for his death." Anthropologist Christopher Boehm calls these cultural leveling mechanisms, plus the threat of retaliation, or even of capital punishment for dominance behavior, a reverse dominance hierarchy, meaning the community collectively dominates potential alpha men, preventing them from establishing any kind of hierarchy. So if you don't like the idea of egalitarianism, you can call it reverse dominance hierarchy to feel more comfortable. Same difference. But if you do like egalitarianism, like communists and anarchists, it's also great news. Not only are human beings capable of a high degree of egalitarianism, this egalitarianism was most likely the norm for much of the past 300,000 years of our existence as anatomically modern humans, and probably a lot longer than that, and it shaped our very nature as a species. And the reason for that egalitarianism was the relative equality of bargaining power inherent to the logistical realities of immediate return hunting and gathering. But, hold your horses, anarchists and communists. We might be capable of equality, but we currently live in a world full of endless hierarchy, with only a few 100,000 people left in egalitarian hunting and gathering bands, and 0 egalitarian industrial civilizations. How did we get from there to here, and is there any way to go back? To answer these questions, it's useful to look at other subsistence societies. And we can start with delayed return hunter-gatherers, also called complex hunter-gatherers. Unlike immediate return foraging, which is basically one type of economy, the term complex foragers includes a variety of different types of economies. What they share in common is that they don't engage in agriculture and that they do process and store food for later use. The various Native American tribes of the Pacific Northwest coast, such as the Haida, the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Tlingit, and others, are traditionally complex hunter-gatherers, whose type of economic activity differed greatly from the immediate return foraging that we described earlier. So instead of following big game animals all year, the traditional Pacific Northwest coast foraging economy was centered on control over salmon and other fixed fishing territories and the surrounding areas. As a result, the various Pacific Northwest coast tribes were largely sedentary, living in fixed villages with long-term housing and other permanent structures, though they would go on long hunting and raiding expeditions for much of the year. The salmon territories were in and of themselves great wealth, and great wealth means that there's something to steal, which means defense, and something to store, which means resource management. And sedentary living and permanent housing means that you can store and defend your wealth. And fixed settlements with wealth to protect and own also means that it's more complicated to just up and leave if someone is trying to dominate you. You can't just start your own band, and if you leave your family, you're leaving important property, power, and wealth behind. Marriage and divorce become more complicated because marriage starts to involve the spouse's family and their access to resources and territories. So arranged marriage is incentivized to keep precious territories in the right hands and to maintain one's family's wealth and prestige. And stored wealth in prized territories means war and raiding and defense, which incentivizes the cooperation and tight coordination of larger groups of people to defend those resources or to attack others and raid them for their resources. And the result of all this is hierarchy. Pacific Northwest coast cultures had authoritative chiefs and delineated social ranks and social classes, chiefly nobility and commoners, with social power based on wealth inequality. And they had slaves, which were people captured in raids and brought in from far away, to where they had no allies and were surrounded by enemy warriors, and thus had to do what they were told if they wanted access to food and shelter. As we talked about in episode 3, hierarchy is an effective way of efficiently coordinating group activities in tasks where discipline is required, like war. And it's also a good way to prevent conflicts over resources. When there are resources to be divided, you basically have 3 options. You can have equal distribution, which is really difficult if not impossible to enforce when there isn't relatively equal bargaining power, plus a need for cooperation. You can have hierarchical distribution, which will tend towards matching the relative bargaining power of different parties or people. Or else, you can have constant disputes and violence, as people are constantly making justifications for why they deserve a bigger share than they're getting. You're a poo-poo face and I'm an Adonis. God loves me and God hates you. I have a college degree and you can't read, etc. Think of the fall of the Roman Empire. When you no longer had a big hierarchical structure dominating and unifying all of those territories, they broke up into smaller polities of relatively equal standing, who fought each other endlessly through the Middle Ages, until they were amalgamated into bigger polities. And those bigger states also fought each other, until capitalism ended up binding the elites of the different capitalist states into a web of hierarchy and cooperation. Hierarchy avoids disputes by determining in advance who wins in a would-be battle, and who gets what. And a stable hierarchy will match the actual existing bargaining power of the various parties, as people normally won't bother getting into a battle that they know they won't win, unless they're seriously provoked. There are different ways to establish and maintain hierarchies, but if you want to manage intergenerational wealth that's controlled by a family or a lineage, like a prized fishing territory, one common method is by appointing the eldest person from that lineage as the top authority, who after all represents the earliest common link between everyone in the lineage. And then you have those lineages out of the group of related lineages which control the most resources and which have the most bargaining power to be recognized as noble lineages, and appoint the chief of the most powerful one as the chief of the entire community. And so, to avoid constant war within their own societies over fishing spots and other important resources, Pacific Northwest coast cultures developed hierarchical social structures based on lineage and age and wealth, where different families and clans and lineages got access to different territories. And they had great chiefs in charge of war planning and wealth distribution, which was done according to status and rank. And they had, and still have, great potlatches, where the chief redistributes great wealth, according to social status. The higher your status, the more you get, which maintains the chief's legitimacy and keeps the system stable. And of course, I'm just giving the materialist perspective on culture. There is a whole complex system of ritual, belief, and art that holds all of this together. A spirit hierarchy of secret ritual knowledge, which bolsters and further shapes and conceptualizes the hierarchy of the material world, and gives these societies not only more stability, like the leveling mechanisms and egalitarian values do for immediate return foragers, but it also gives meaning and beauty to life. And the Pacific Northwest Coast people are famous for their incredible totem poles, paintings, masks, costumes, dances, and songs, which shape their spiritual and material worlds. In short, the Pacific Northwest Coast hunter-gatherers developed a hierarchical social order because it was possible to do so, and because it was beneficial for them to do so. By monopolizing and defending access to prime fishing spots, some groups of people had the means to dominate other people, and they also had political hierarchy because it made sense and created stability. Political and economic hierarchy stabilizes competition over fixed resources, both within families and lineages and clans, and between them. And it reduces conflict and chaos that harms everyone, particularly the people at the top of the various hierarchies, who will fight to maintain the existing system even when it's harming the rest of the society, as we'll see in future episodes. So, human societies can be structured hierarchically, where some people dominate others, or they can be structured according to the principle of equality, where everyone has relatively the same political power and wealth. when bargaining power between people is relatively equal, and when cooperation is required for survival, which is the situation with immediate return foraging, you get political equality. And when circumstances give some people advantages over others, as is the case for those clans among the various foragers of the Pacific Northwest coast who controlled the better and worse territories, you get various types of hierarchies. Cultures can shift from hierarchy to equality, or the other way around, over time, as circumstances change. The shift can be gradual. For example, archaeological evidence shows that Pacific Northwest coast hierarchy seems to have emerged over a period of centuries, after they had begun practicing a salmon storing economy. Or the shift can be quick, happening in a generation or less, as we'll see next episode. But sometimes, the same culture will go from more hierarchy to more equality seasonally, like every year, as they switch between types of seasonal economic activity in ways that result in changes of relative bargaining power. For example, the hierarchical structure of the Pacific Northwest coast peoples is most rigid in their winter world, when they gather together in large numbers in fixed settlements. And it relaxes into more relative egalitarianism when they break up into smaller bands to practice hunting and gathering, and roam around their territories semi-nomadically, as various hierarchies become less relevant and harder to enforce. And this duality is reflected in their religious practices, where people even have different names in the winter season versus the summer season. Another example of this is the Nambiquara indigenous people of Brazil. When Claude Lévi-Strauss went to live with them in the late 1930s, he saw that they had authoritative chiefs in the rainy season, when they practiced garden agriculture in fixed villages, and then during the rest of the year, when people would break off into nomadic hunting and gathering bands, those chiefs lost all of their authority and had to re-earn their following by being good leaders and gaining the respect of the band, because people who don't like a chief could just take off and ditch them to join another group where they had family or friends, much like it is among immediate return hunters and gatherers. In other words, when they shifted to economic activity that resembled that of immediate return hunting and gathering, the logistical conditions and the balance of power shifted as well, and their social structures reflected that shift. If we look at the archaeological record and apply insights from the ethnographic record of the cultures that we know about in order to interpret it, we get a narrative of a hierarchical pre-human ancestor to gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos 10 million years ago or so. And then as we branch off into our respective lines, about 2 million years ago, a Homo ancestor, maybe Homo erectus or Homo habilis, develops lethal projectile weapons, which triggers a shift away from dominance hierarchies as belligerent alpha males get progressively weeded out, until we get anatomically modern humans coming on the scene about 300,000 years ago as egalitarian immediate return hunter-gatherers. And then, as the climate and geography start changing, starting at about 30 to 40,000 years ago, we get some evidence of possible complex hunter-gatherers emerging in certain areas where population pressure and environmental conditions made that type of economy possible or advantageous. And the emergence of complex foragers with their semi-sedentary lives and large concentrations of people relative to immediate return foragers, and their complex ritual and religious life, coincides with the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, where we start to find evidence of more complex symbolic life among humans, versus immediate return societies who tend not to practice any visual art. And then, about 12,000 years ago, something big happens, so that after millions of years of hunting and gathering, and 300,000 years of modern human beings likely living in relative equality, hierarchical societies start spreading like wildfire, along with male domination, organized violence, and chronic malnutrition, so that by about 5,000 years ago, the majority of humans were living in hierarchical societies of one sort or another. And by today, more than 99.9% of human beings are organized this way, with less than 150,000 people still living in egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands. And we'll discuss what that world-changing event was, and a bunch of other fascinating things like male domination, matrilineal societies, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the women's suffrage movement, the anarchist revolution in Spain in the 1930s, and whether egalitarian societies make any sense in the industrialized world in the next episode. In the meantime, if you're interested in what we talked about today, and I hope you are, because I find it mind-blowing and fundamental to understanding politics, then there are mountains and mountains of books and academic articles that you might want to read, and I'll put a few of my favorites in the show notes, and maybe do a mini bonus episode on them. But, before that, please tell your friends, and your social media friends, and your parasocial media friends about this podcast. If you know someone with a popular podcast or YouTube show who has some reach, who might like this show, and who might give it a little boost. That seems to be the main way that people can find out about podcasts and YouTube shows nowadays, so please do that if you can. and rate and review it on iTunes. Like and subscribe with a bell on YouTube. Ask me any questions or corrections or criticisms in the YouTube video comments, or by email at worldwidescroats@gmail.com, and send me some of that Patreon money so that I can keep doing this. And until next time, see ya! Hello, fellow kids, and welcome back to What is Politics. For the past few episodes, we've been looking at the political left and right. Politics is about who gets to make decisions, and our society is made up of various hierarchies, where some people have Hello, fellow kids, and welcome back to What is Politics. For the past few episodes, we've been looking at the political left and right. Politics is about who gets to make decisions, and our society is made up of various hierarchies, where some people have more decision-making power than others, based on political institutions, differences in economic wealth, and cultural status. On the right, you have those people who want to give more power to the people at the top of these hierarchies, and on the left, you have those who want to give more power to the people at the bottom, or who want to get rid of these hierarchies entirely. In other words, the right represents the forces of hierarchy, and the left represents the forces of equality. If you're new to this podcast and you think that left and right mean anything other than hierarchy versus equality, go listen to episode 5 and then episode 4 and then come back. And don't write me emails about it until you do. Anyhow, last episode, we started doing some political anthropology to understand some of the nuts and bolts of left and right and of human politics. And we saw that even though the terms left and right only pop into our vocabulary with the French Revolution in 1789, the tension between hierarchy and equality has been at the heart of human politics since before we were even anatomically modern human beings. And we saw that until about 12,000 years ago, it was usually equality that came out on top. Before that time, we have every reason to believe that most humans were organized into nomadic hunter-gatherer bands with political, economic, and gender equality. And then after 12,000 years ago, hierarchical societies start appearing everywhere and spreading like wildfire all across the world, until we get to today, where almost everyone is part of a hierarchical society, and there are only about 100 or 200,000 people still left as egalitarian foragers, foraging being another word for hunting and gathering. And we looked at two different types of hunter-gatherer societies. First, we looked at various societies around the world who practice a nomadic form of hunting and gathering called immediate return foraging. And we saw that every known culture who practices this type of foraging is always extremely egalitarian. And then we looked at the Pacific Northwest coast cultures, who practiced a very different type of sedentary hunting and gathering economy based on fixed salmon fishing territories. And we saw that these hunter-gatherers had developed elaborate political, economic, and spiritual hierarchies, with chiefs, nobilities, and slaves. And we saw that what makes immediate return hunter-gatherers so egalitarian, and what made Pacific Northwest coast societies so hierarchical, has everything to do with the relative bargaining power of the various actors in these societies. And we saw that bargaining power itself is a result of the practical realities created by the different types of economies that each type of society practiced. The practical realities of nomadic immediate return foraging are such that there's just no way for anyone to dominate anyone else, or to accumulate more wealth than anyone else, which isn't true of the sedentary economies of the traditional Pacific Northwest coast. On today's episode, we're going to apply what we learned about hierarchy, equality, and bargaining power to understand why there are so few egalitarian societies left in the world today, and why male dominance and patriarchy are so prevalent in the world. Before I begin, a few people wrote to me after the last episode to tell me that I've been giving you outdated information, and that anthropologists David Graeber and David Wengrow have recently disproved the whole idea that most humans were egalitarian hunter-gatherers until 12,000 years ago. I'm actually well aware of Graeber and Wengrow's articles on this subject, and while I'm a big admirer of David Graeber, I can tell you that even though I find these articles stimulating, their main claims are not only wrong, but they're rotting our brains. Graeber and Wengrow make two main claims in these articles. First, that people were going back and forth between hierarchy and equality in the Paleolithic era. And second, that the reason that they were going back and forth is because they were just like trying to figure out new things and experimenting with new social possibilities, like The first argument is a matter of interpreting the archaeological and geological record, and the details aren't really relevant to this podcast. Even if Graeber's claim were correct, it wouldn't change anything I'm saying about how hierarchy and equality in human politics work. So I'll address them in a Q&A bonus episode. Basically, the climate was fluctuating too wildly during the Paleolithic for hierarchy to be possible or functional outside of exceptional microclimates, though this was likely happening more frequently towards the end of the Paleolithic. I'll post an article by Doron Schulnitzer in the show notes on this. There's also a really interesting and growing body of evidence from human physiology that strongly suggests that humans evolved in an egalitarian context. I'll save that for its own episode, but I'll put in an article by Camila Power in the show notes that summarizes some of these arguments. Anyhow, the really awful part of Graeber and Wengrow's articles is their second argument, where they claim that the reason that people move from hierarchy to equality or vice versa, whether in the past or in the present, is because they're just experimenting. This is the heart of their thesis and their political project, and it's making everyone who reads it stupid, and it's taking away our ability to understand human politics. The whole reason that I started doing these political anthropology episodes is to counter nonsense like this. I was actually writing Graeber a friendly email about these articles when he tragically died, so I don't know what his reaction would have been to my critiques, which I'll now be presenting as part of this episode. Unlike Graeber and so many anthropologists and historians and political theorists, what we're doing in this series is that we're looking at hierarchy and equality and other questions about culture, history, and politics through a materialist lens. In other words, we're working on the assumption that people don't just organize into hunter-gatherer bands or kingdoms or republics because they have particular values, or because some particularly clever person decided to become king or to invent democracy, or because people did a bunch of ayahuasca and thought it would be trippy to do social experiments. We're working on the assumption that people organize into these different configurations because there are material and practical conditions that push us into making certain choices and into accepting certain compromises. And we're also assuming that the values that people have, that we have, are shaped by the same material circumstances that shape our social structures and our political institutions. And we're not just making these assumptions based on some gut feeling or ideology. We're making these assumptions because we see it play out over and over in the anthropological record in so many ways, which we'll see as we go along. And the reason I'm focusing on the anthropological record and small-scale societies like hunter-gatherer bands instead of the historical record in big civilizations is because the political and material dynamics are just so much easier to make out in smaller groups with a limited range of economic activities versus in huge societies with zillions of people doing zillions of different kinds of activities. It's like how you want to learn how atoms and molecules and basic compounds and basic chemistry works before you can figure out what's going on in a giant radioactive toxic waste dump full of different chemicals reacting together in all sorts of ways at the same time. In Graeber and Wengrow's articles, they look at how some societies from recent times, like the Inuit, or the Pacific Northwest Coast peoples, or the Nambikwara, shift from more hierarchy to more equality seasonally. And they compare these cultures to some archaeological finds, which suggest that there were some societies with social hierarchy in the Paleolithic era. And they conclude that ancient hunter-gatherers and recent hunter-gatherers and other societies were and are shifting between hierarchy and equality because they're, quote, self-consciously experimenting with different social possibilities, unquote. No. People shift from more hierarchy to more equality seasonally because people are shifting to different economic activities seasonally. And these different activities create certain practical realities, which change the level of relative bargaining power between different people and groups from season to season. Nambikwara chiefs can boss people around in the gardening season when everyone's stuck in one place, but they lose that coercive aspect of their authority in the nomadic hunting season, because at that time, people can just move to a different band to avoid an annoying chief. And Inuit men can dominate Inuit women in the summer season, because in the summer, the Arctic animals that they hunt disperse in such a way that people live in very small groups of 1 or 2 nuclear families, where a man can just overpower a woman with no interference. But Inuit men lose much of their patriarchal authority in the winter, which is the time of a massive concentrated seal hunt, because at that time they're living in large multifamily dwellings where women can get away from their husbands, and where they have male relatives around who can keep their husbands in check. Note that I'm using the exact same examples that Graeber and Wengrow cite in their articles, but to make the exact opposite argument. And I got this stuff from the exact same sources that they put in the bibliography of their articles. Unfortunately, Graeber, like many anthropologists who are educated in the postmodernist dark ages of the humanities, misses all of these material connections. So he just thinks that people are organizing differently because experiments. I'm going to do at least one, if not several episodes on how academia turns brilliant, beautiful minds into fluorescent, smooth jello. But for now, just think about how ridiculous Graeber's thesis is. People don't just do mad bong rips and then say, dude, I have a cool experiment. I'll be the pharaoh, and I'll have all the power and wealth. And you guys will be the slaves. And you can spend your whole life getting whipped and work yourself to death building pyramids that glorify me for all eternity. And the other guys who get to be the slaves are like, dude, yes, bro. And nobody ever ate a bunch of magic mushrooms and said, whoa, I had a great idea. How about if all the dudes get all the authority and power, and then all the chicks have to stay home and make us steaks and clean our underwears? And if you don't like it, we get to smack you around, 'cause you're our property. And the women are like, awesome! Woo! Let's experiment with that and see how it goes. And then it went so well that they stuck with it for the last 12,000 years. No, people aren't self-consciously experimenting with hierarchy and equality. What they're experimenting with is which kinds of economic activities and defense strategies and residence patterns work best in different contexts and in different seasons. And those activities and those strategies have consequences on bargaining power, which gives some people the ability to dominate others against their will, or not. Everyone wants to have freedom and comfort, and there are often people trying to get freedom and comfort at the expense of other people's freedom and comfort. But there are practical conditions that enable some people to get their way and not others, and that leads to certain compromise being reached as opposed to other compromises. There are times and places where those people who want to dominate win out, and times and places where they can't. Experimentation does happen, but it's about the details of those compromises. It happens when the balance of power starts to shift, and there are periods of instability and opportunity for people to obtain a more favorable compromise. When people with power are experimenting with ways to hold on to that power or expand their power, and when people without power are experimenting with how to grab more power. And when the balance of forces shifts, norms and values and culture shift as well, in order for people to come to terms with the existing order, and to smooth over the tensions inherent in both hierarchy and equality. You don't accept to be a slave because you're experimenting. You accept it because someone with much more power than you gives you the option to be a slave or to die. You accept male domination because you're in a situation where you either submit to male authority or you get beaten or killed. You accept to work at a crappy job with miserable conditions because your alternatives are to get evicted or else to take a worse job with crappier conditions. And maybe your culture is feeding you justifications for why you deserve to be a slave, or a submissive woman, or a poor employee. Or maybe you're inventing your own rationalizations for it so that you can stay sane. But those justifications and those rationalizations emerge as an adaptation to material reality, more than they create that material reality. As people who want to make changes to our current political order, what we want to look at are the conditions that give the pharaoh the power to dominate the slave, or that give men the power to dominate women, or that give the boss the power to dominate his workers. And we also want to look at the conditions that allow for change to happen. And that's what we're doing. Now, the idea that material and practical realities shape culture, social structure, and ideology might sound like some highfalutin fancy school learning, but it's very basic, and we all know this from personal life experience. Last time I gave the example of office workers versus artists, where office jobs generate cultures where people repress their feelings, while performance arts environments encourage people to express their feelings openly. This approach to understanding social phenomena has different names. I just call it materialism, or in our case, when we're looking at politics, we can call it political materialism. But you'll often see terms like historical materialism, cultural materialism, cultural ecology, behavioral ecology, or Marxism. And not Marxism as in socialism or communism, but Marxism as in Karl Marx's way of analyzing social phenomena through the lens of material conditions and the different material interests of different classes of people. Marx didn't invent the materialist approach. Every 4-year-old uses it, and you can see it employed in ancient texts from around the world, right through to some of Marx's contemporaries. But Marx articulated it and applied it in a uniquely systematic and forceful fashion to politics and to history. Now, although materialism is associated with Karl Marx, and many materialist scholars were explicitly Marxist socialists, it doesn't mean that materialist analysis is inherently left-wing or socialist in any way. You can use a materialist analysis for right-wing purposes, just like you can use it for left-wing purposes. For example, You can read a book called Culture and Conflict in the Middle East by anthropologist Carl Philip Salzman, who is my professor at McGill, and who is a specialist on nomadic pastoralist societies, meaning societies that live principally from animal herding. His book uses classic materialist explanations of various traits common to nomadic pastoralist cultures, which Arab civilization was originally based on. From this, he derives an argument about conflicts in the Middle East, and the Arab-Israeli conflict in particular, that would make any left-winger's head explode. He basically blames the entire conflict on the backwardness of Arab culture and its pastoralist influences. Now, where someone like Salzman uses materialism to advance right-wing ideas, what David Graeber was trying to do with his recent work is that he was trying to do away with materialism in a misguided attempt to advance a particular left-wing political project. A project that I agree with, even though I think he was going about it in exactly the wrong way. Many people argue that egalitarian societies are only possible in small groups, like a hunter-gatherer band, where everyone can police everyone else, or where you can reach consensus without destroying efficiency. These are materialist arguments. And the same people who make these arguments will go on to insist that you can't have equality in larger societies without having some kind of tyrannical political hierarchy to enforce it. And that in turn means that real equality is impossible, because if you have an authority imposing equality from above, that's a political hierarchy. So according to these arguments, the French Revolutionary slogan of equality, fraternity, and liberty is an oxymoron. You can have equality or liberty, but not both. Or you can have political equality or economic equality, but not both. These are inherently right-wing arguments. The right is by definition always arguing that you can't have more equality, and the left is always arguing that you can. Now, Graeber is an anarchist socialist who wanted a much more egalitarian world, and who was active in trying to make that happen in various ways, like he was very important in the Occupy movement, and has been a lifelong activist for all sorts of causes. So in order to argue against the idea that humans are forever doomed to live in hierarchy by the material realities of civilization, Graeber wants to throw away the whole idea that material realities shape our lives. Instead, he wants to advance the idea that we can just experiment our way out of hierarchical society if we want to, the same way that we supposedly experimented into it. What I'll be telling you today is that even though I agree with Graeber that we're not necessarily stuck with the existing state of affairs, if we actually want to change anything, we can't do it by just dropping a bunch of acid into the water supply and start experimenting with having dessert before supper and having janitors become senators. If we want to change things, we need to understand the realities that we live in order to figure out how we can work within the existing constraints to alter the balance of power of the various actors and classes and interest groups in our societies. So the first question that I want to address is, why is the world today almost entirely hierarchical? Whether you believe Graeber's theory about people going back and forth from hierarchy to equality in the Paleolithic, or whether you believe the standard theory that people were mostly egalitarian, everyone agrees that there was a massive shift to hierarchy starting around 12,000 years ago. At the end of one of Graeber and Wengrow's pieces, they ask the same question. Quote, "If there is a riddle here, it is why, after millennia of constructing and disassembling forms of hierarchy, why is it that Homo sapiens, supposedly the wisest of apes, allowed permanent and intractable systems of inequality to first take root?" Well, newsflash. We have had the answer to this question since at least the 1960s, if not the 1760s, when various Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau theorized that hierarchy began when people switched from hunting and gathering to agriculture, though they didn't really have the correct reasons why. And then again in the 19th century, Lewis Henry Morgan, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Engels also arrived at that same conclusion, but also for the wrong reasons, although they were a bit closer because they were at least looking at material conditions. Today, we have enough anthropological and archaeological information to know that hierarchy does indeed start spreading around the world after the rise of agriculture, which is first practiced on a continual basis about 12,000 years ago. We also know that the reason why agriculture starts at this time is related to changes in the global climate, which made continuous agriculture possible for the first time around 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago marks the beginning of the Holocene era, which is our current geological era. Before that time, in the Pleistocene geological era, which is also the Paleolithic technological era for humans, before that time, we now know that dependence on agriculture was not a viable economic strategy. The climate fluctuated too frequently, and there was not enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or in the soil to make dependable productive agriculture possible. The consequences of this geological change is that after 12,000 years ago, if a hunter-gatherer population goes through a major crisis, whether it's because of resource depletion, overpopulation, or climate change, instead of collapsing and dying from starvation like they might have in the Pleistocene era, they now have the option of using agriculture to either supplement their diets or else as a basis for their entire economy. And so, over the next couple of thousand years, you have people in different areas around the world being forced by their circumstances into agriculture for the first time. Note that I say forced into agriculture. Most people who aren't familiar with the relevant anthropology think that some genius invented agriculture because hunting and gathering was so precarious and unreliable, and that agriculture was a giant leap forward that everyone adopted as soon as they found out about it. But in reality, it turns out that agricultural life is usually a big step downwards from hunting and gathering, in terms of standard of living. And we've known this since the mid-1960s. Most recent hunter-gatherers, for example, are familiar with agricultural techniques, but they choose not to engage in them unless they have to, because it's whack. While hunter-gatherers are eating a wide variety of meat, honey, fruits, nuts, and mushrooms, and while they're enjoying lots of leisure time and traveling with their families and friends thanks to their 15 to 40-hour work weeks, which includes fun hunting trips with their pals, agriculturalists are working from dawn till dusk, stuck on a small plot of land, pounding grain into meal over and over for hours and hours, all so that they can eat a diet consisting largely of tasteless glorp, like mealy meal, or else bread or jungle potatoes. In terms of stability, food security, and risk avoidance, agriculture and food storage are a magnet for vermin, raiders, and conquerors, and farmers are subject to frequent droughts and famines. Meanwhile, nomadic foragers usually have a lot of alternatives and options when their preferred foods are not available. And in times of famine, it's usually the agricultural people who go and live with their hunter-gatherer neighbors, and not the other way around. And all of this is even more true of early agriculture, where people hadn't yet figured out how to get a balanced diet out of agricultural foods. Look at the archaeological record. We see that people who switched from foraging to agriculture for the first time after the Holocene starts had clear signs of malnutrition and worse health than their foraging predecessors had. In areas where there was land perfect for agriculture, like in western North America, people continued to hunt and gather for 10,000 years before finally being pushed into farming. And when Polynesian sailors, who had been agriculturalists for thousands of years, discovered and settled in empty Hawaii and New Zealand, both times they switched from their traditional horticulture, meaning garden agriculture, back to hunting and gathering. And they remained hunters and gatherers for hundreds of years until the populations on those new islands got too high, and they had to revert back to horticulture. The biblical fall from the Garden of Eden story is thought to be a metaphor for how the ancestors of the ancient Israelites were forced out of their hunter-gatherer life of relative ease and plenty and into a hard life of agricultural labor. Even the way that Adam and Eve became ashamed of their bodies once they left the Garden of Eden reflects how immediate return forager cultures have a lot of sexual freedom, while sexual shame and repression is a regular feature of their agricultural and pastoral neighbors, for reasons that we'll look at another time, relating to patriarchy and property. If you know your Old Testament, it's great to reread it with anthropological and historical knowledge in mind. Like if you track what type of economy the Hebrews and the Israelites practiced in different biblical periods, going from foragers to pastoralists, and agro-pastoralists to state societies, you can see how their values and their practices resemble recent people from different parts of the world who practice those same types of economies. Anyhow, people are only switching from hunting and gathering to agriculture because they have to. And once you have a few cultures living primarily by intensive forms of agriculture like rice and grain cultivation, it's off to the races. Nomadic immediate return hunting and gathering supports a population of about 0.1 people per square kilometer, and they tend to reproduce slowly to stay in that range. They usually breastfeed their children to some extent until they're about 3.5 or 4, and the hormones produced by breastfeeding are a natural form of contraception, on top of whatever other methods of contraception that they might use. So they usually only have one kid every 4 years or so, or more. More intensive sedentary foraging economies, like the Pacific Northwest coast economies, can support populations of about 1 person per square kilometer. But rice agriculture can support as many as 1,000 people per square kilometer, and rice farmers reproduce accordingly. It's no coincidence that the two most populated civilizations in the world, India and China, have their roots in rice farming. Individual farmers are more productive and successful if they have more kids to do more farm labor for them, and farmer women stop breastfeeding their children at about age 1 because of the availability of milk from domesticated herd animals. So they crank out babies sometimes almost every year. And this makes them more land hungry, and their numbers make them more powerful, so they easily take over hunter-gatherer land. And the more land they take over, the more existing hunter-gatherers get squeezed into small territories, and they eventually get forced into agriculture themselves, as there isn't enough land to support foraging anymore. So by about 5,000 years ago, heading into biblical times, agriculturalists are the majority of the world. Before the 19th century European expansion, you still had 20% of the world left foraging, but by the middle of the 20th century, agriculture and industrial civilization supported by agriculture are everywhere, except in the most marginal areas of the world, where foragers sometimes still remain. This explains why agriculture spread everywhere. But why does the spread of agriculture coincide with the spread of hierarchical society? The answer to this is because agriculture presents a lot of the same logistical realities that lead to hierarchy in the Pacific Northwest coast societies that we looked at last episode, except on steroids. A sedentary economy based on agriculture